Welcome to Tree Book Passages, the podcast where we share readings from our favorite books about trees. We're Doug Still and Georgia Silvera Simons.
We are doing something different this episode. We are talking with authors, and we're pleased to be joined by the co-editors of the new book, Branching Out, The Public History of Trees. I'm going to turn it over to Leah and Philip to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Leah Glaser. I am a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University in New Britain. I also coordinate the public history program here. And I have my area of specialty is really historic preservation, but in general aspects of public history. And I am the founder and former chair of the Committee on Environmental Sustainability with the National Council on Public History. So I've had a real interest in combining environmental and public history in the last decade or so.
Right. I'm Philip Levy. I'm a professor of history at the University of South Florida, and most of my work I do a lot with historical archaeology and landscape, which is kind of how I arrived at this. An interest in how landscapes function as memorial spaces and then the various objects on them and how they function. A lot of what I've dealt with has been about George Washington and places related to his life versus a very famous tree at the center of his story. And I think that's kind of what pulled me into working with trees more and more. I'm an outgoing chair of the Committee on Environmental Sustainability, also for the National Council of Public History. So there's an overlap there.
That's how we met.
I was going to ask. Well, we greatly enjoyed your book. There's a lot to talk about. There's so much in every essay. I would say, broadly speaking, Branching Out is a collection of essays. Are there 12 or are there 14? I can't remember. That you have edited about trees in history. But in your own words, could you describe what the book is about and how this project came together?
So there's 12 essays, and I'm sure we both have slightly different answers to this, but the book is about looking at trees as not just natural objects, which the public tends to see them as part of nature, but at the same time, I think the public instinctively sees trees as something more cultural. And in historic and cultural resource management, there's always been this tension in terms of how the natural and the cultural are divided. And trees just seem like the ideal vehicle to really break down that concept. And they provide all kinds of opportunities to talk about the history of place, which is what public history focuses on.
Yeah, a lot of scholars have been challenging us to reconsider the boundary between the human and the natural in light of climate change and the effects that humanity has had on living conditions on the planet. And that pushes us to look at things that are sort of otherwise understood as being objects of nature into sort of how they interact with people and how people interact with them and how we're sort of all sharing a space on almost equal terms. So there's that dimension to it. But I think it's also really important, and part of what we talked about in putting the book together and tried to get into the material was that we don't want to see questions of environment and climate as strictly the domain of environmental history, that we want to see a field like public history and other fields as well embrace it as fully as possible, because it's an everybody topic. It's much bigger than any one single subdiscipline. So we were very much urging people to write from a public history perspective and ask public history questions, which are about memory, engagement, place, and how and interpretation. And preservation as well. So trees provide a really amazing space to talk about that, because they're at once, they can be objects, this is what we talk about in the book, but they can be objects of preservation, trying to maintain the life of a tree. But they are at the same time, unlike a building or a bridge or some other thing that could be preserved seemingly as long as its materials hold out. Trees are living creatures, living objects, I guess is a better word to say. They're living entities, and they have lifespans, and their lifespans end, and that has an impact on memory and how a place is recalled. But at the same time, trees also can imperil other kinds of memory spaces. They can fall on them. They can drop limbs on them. So they're complex and contradictory, and there really had not been an exploration of the possibilities that they hold in this space. They'd been treated either as cellulose sources or just, a venerable tree. But there's this more complicated question about this. On the one hand, sort of celebrating approach you could have to memory trees, but on the other hand, the danger that trees can pose to historical sites and historical objects.
And more complicated stories they can tell, rather than just something for commemoration or celebration, as Phil mentioned. We came up with this idea for a book and a contribution of essays, and I can talk about my my essay later. But I had really come to this by seeing after hurricanes Irene and Sandy here up in the Northeast had knocked down all kinds of power lines, and people were out of power and very upset for a while. And the solution seemed to be that it was the trees' fault, and to take away the trees, and this idea that trees and power lines couldn't coexist. But my first book was about electricity and power, and I was very frustrated and fascinated by how the public rallied to save trees and pushed against these policies. So began doing some panels at the National Council of Public History, just to kind of explore it a little more. And then around the pandemic time, or the eve of the pandemic time, I was talking to Phil on the phone. And then at some point I said, my dream is to have a book called The Public History of Trees. And right away, Phil said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So that's kind of the origins of it.
And you found these people that had these stories to tell. I bet some of them were written prior, or did they have them sort of in the bag, or did they write them for this book?
These are all new essays, which I think is really important. It makes an essay volume take longer when you have to have everybody write from scratch. But it's not only that they're new, but in many cases, people are deviating from their regular work to sort of explore a dimension of what they were working on anyway that had a tree hiding in it somewhere, but had not been brought into focus. And I know from conversations with them that it has an impact on their larger work, and pushing to sort of see the tree as the object, the center of the story, as opposed to people or a building or what have you, has kind of led them to rethink other things. So it's productive in that way as well.
We did tap some of the people who had been part of various panels over the years, but they didn't necessarily write on what they had delivered a paper on, for example. I did, but and partially maybe Phil also. But we were sort of, by doing these panels, we were attracting people who were interested in this whole idea. And so we knew that this was something that we could easily recruit for, considering the interest that we'd already seen.
Phil, the comment you made a little bit ago about asking folks to center trees as the subjects of these essays, because often trees are just, or anything green and living, are often just kind of a background to some people's lives. So it's really wonderful to read many tens of pages about trees as characters. Yeah, I really like the assignment that you gave to the contributing authors.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm glad that came through. It was important to me that that happened, that the tree be at the center, and we talk a lot in historical writing about agency, like, who has agency, and how do stories construct around actions. And although that is certainly not the way everybody thinks, and there's an enormous amount of work that doesn't see the world that way, but even so, until you sit down to do it, it's a bit of a head change. And so asking people to shift aside and less about how a person or a character or an event or place interacted with the tree from that perspective, but rather turn it around and talk about what agency does the tree have, or do trees have in their own situations. And for me, that came down to things like the natural characteristics of the tree. Like, different trees function differently. They look different over time. They have different attributes. And that attribute, if you turn it around, then those dimensions, that attribute of the tree is eliciting action from people, right? Rather than people sort of saying, I need this and this tree does it. The tree is offering these attributes. And then so what is it that people do with those attributes? And you sort of invert the story that way and put the tree at the center.
Very interesting. You divided the book into two parts. Part one is trees, places, and communities. And part two is trees as symbols and interpreted objects. So why did you choose to structure the book that way into these two parts?
I think we were initially going for like 3 or 4 parts, but once we got all the essays, we sat and we looked at them all and just tried to categorize them. And we went over a lot of, I think, more complicated categories, but then kind of settled on this idea of many trees, groups of trees, and then the lone tree as ways to approach these different stories. And that was kind of a simple, descriptive kind of way of categorizing.
It also spoke to the trees exist in the landscape, right? That they're either alone or they're in groups, and the essays came to us that way, and it just happened to divide that way. So we'll talk about my own work on this later, but initially, what I had imagined I was going to write about was very different than what I wrote about. My initial project was a bit more like Leah's. I was looking at a set of trees in Fredericksburg, Virginia, or I should say more specifically opposite the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, that block the view of downtown from Chatham, which was a site of the Civil War battle in 1862. And I was very interested in the way the Park Service was dealing with those trees, because on the one hand, they have their sort of preservation ethic is to keep things on the land that are on the land. And Park Service is very disinclined to mess with the landscape too much, particularly the historical one. But on the other hand, the visitorship, the people who were going to that site, what they wanted was the view of Fredericksburg as it would have been seen as much as possible during the Civil War. So there's a tension then between the trees that are at once part of the landscape and are functioning. I mean, it's a ravine. It's not a ravine. It's a ledge. It's a ridge that goes down to the water. So I was just very interested in the way that the tree was sort of a complicated participant in that discussion. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and I couldn't get access to the records I wanted. And so, so there it was. I wasn't able to write that. And we'll talk more about later, I guess, but I just fell back into records I'd collected already and wrote something that in the end, I'm really happy I got to write. So I feel like COVID was in that respect was sort of a challenge that produced something probably better than what I was going to do before.
Yeah, I'll second that. What really motivated us really putting in this proposal was I was on sabbatical during COVID also, and my original research, I couldn't do. So then looked back on what have I really liked that I haven't written about yet. And there was this paper, different versions of this paper I kept presenting, but I'd never, put into writing and published. So
I think COVID changed a lot of perspectives. At least it did with mine. I left my job and started this podcast and did some things that I found very challenging in telling stories about trees and culture and history. But it's interesting to see that you sort of looked at it that way too.
I was teaching a local and community history class when we were all online. And normally in my local and community history class, we go to local archives and do a lot of work in the community. So what I did instead was I had the students look at tree stories. I had them look at this notable tree list in Connecticut, choose something. The idea was to get them outside so they wouldn't be in front of their computer, and to go visit the tree. They had to take a picture and submit it, and then research what they could about the tree, get an angle on it, whether it was commemorative, whether it was a witness tree, what have you. And then luckily, just because of who I know in Connecticut, we were able to get it on the state history podcast and kind of record it like this over Zoom. So it's a little uneven, but it's a sort of mishmash of different tree stories.
That's an important thing to point out. I'll sidebar that because I teach a course on monuments and memorials that does essentially the same kind of assignment. And a lot of people teaching public history sort of encourage students to get outside of the classroom and go find a thing and experience a thing. In Tampa, where I teach, it's a monuments class. So they go out and find a local monument or memorial. And part of their first assignment is I said I have to spend 90 minutes at the monument. They have to stay there with it. They have to kind of stick with it for a long time and watch how traffic comes and goes and whether people come or don't come and how the sun hits it and how it changes its shadow over time. They have to kind of learn to connect with it. And the trees are sort of function exactly the same way. You can do that as well.
Georgia has a similar project going on, right?
Yeah, I'm in New York City, and in my local park, I run a phenology project, and we have several different kinds of volunteers who observe trees. I ask students in my class to pick a tree that we're observing formally, and then they have to follow the changes in that tree for the entire semester. In another class, they compare this tree that's nearby to one that they choose in Greenwood Cemetery, which is a private cemetery in the city but open to the public, but it's a very different landscape than some of our more typical small urban parks. So yeah, this idea of spending intentional time with a tree is really important, and students tell me it's an experience many of them haven't had before, and it's totally changed their perceptions of trees in cities.
Yeah, I think I got a lot of responses that they knew about this tree and maybe that's why they chose it, but they kind of ignored it and it was just didn't think about it. So now obviously it's a whole new perspective.
Yeah.
My street where I grew up was blighted by the Dutch elm plague. So we had trees that were dying. We got to see some of that happen, and we watched trees get old and die. So we kind of got to live through the cycle of the tree and how the streets changed when the trees went away and new ones tried to come in.
Oh yeah, I have some questions about that for Leah and her essay.
Do you want to ask them?
Okay, so one of the essays that really resonated with me was Leah's piece, When a Tree Falls, Listening to and Managing Connecticut's Historic Landscape. And Leah writes, while we often hear these trees fall, whether from natural disaster or urban development, are we listening? And I really love this question. And now that Leah is here with us, I wanted to ask, are we listening, especially with global biodiversity extinctions and a rapidly warming climate? It's, this week in New York City, it's unbelievably hot and humid. And yet still, we are slow when it comes to protecting and planting new trees. So are we listening, Leah?
Yeah, I mean, clearly not. And I think part of it is because people see this dichotomy, or they don't think about trees as part of our human world. So a lot of when I talk, what I hear people saying, whether it's on the street or in the legislature, the tree's dying, we had to take it down, period. And and there was like, okay, well, I guess that's that then. And there's no talk about replanting. And the way I kind of in this essay tried to think about it towards the end there is this idea we apply all these concepts of preservation to buildings, but we can and should apply the same kind of care to preserving trees. So replanting can be kind of seen as reconstruction when you don't have anything left. But when you have a little bit left, you need maintenance is enormous in maintaining a historic property. You can maintain trees, obviously. You can have different sets of rules for how to maintain and protect those, just like we do for buildings. As we just have to think about them again as part of our human world and understand how important they are, particularly with climate change, to not just let them fall and to respond and to try to prevent that destruction by better policy, get more arborists in there to really understand where to plant those trees and which ones to plant and instructions on how to take care of them.
Or there's other ways to mitigate risk.
Yeah.
Fencing or changing patterns around trees or something.
A bunch of big trees came down a couple years ago in my neighborhood from a big storm. They were really old trees and they completely came uprooted, but they were in that space between the sidewalk and the street. And the street had been repaved and some water mains worked on a couple times. And the theory was just that construction just destroyed the root system. And yeah, so we need to be conscientious and see these as really important community resources as well as really important natural resources.
I mean, one thing that your essay also does really well is to spotlight the ways in which memory, the role of memory in our relationships with trees and forested landscapes. So you start that chapter talking about this microburst that damages this mountainous forested landscape. And throughout the chapter, and it's this really beautiful cadence. Like you have these vignettes of these different storm-induced damage. And so there's a really nice rhythm of that through the chapter. And you talk about, I don't know if I can pronounce this word very well, solastalgia, the sort of intense emotional pain associated with landscape change. And it made me think about how for some people, our memories are so short, right? There's like an intense thing that happens and we mourn and then maybe we sort of move on. I think of this because there's some new research out by folks in Australia that shows that people's perceptions of trees really increased positively during COVID lockdown. But after the lockdowns ended, they found that people's perceptions have actually dipped. And I was like, I wonder if there's a way to create a kind of memory of the experience of tree loss, like in a landscape, so people can't actually forget what they felt when the change first happened. I don't know how one would do that, but
I think you're getting to the whole idea of historic preservation that obviously I advocate bringing trees into it is very hard to remember when you don't have that physical thing. And so when people aren't constantly interacting or it's not even there anymore, it is easy to forget. And that's why having physical memorials or structures and objects from those time periods are really important triggers for holding those memories. Otherwise, we do, out of sight, out of mind, to be pretty crude about it. But that is what seems to happen. And I structured that essay in this way because it was looking at the response that we've had over time to these kinds of storms and to trees and the dismissiveness of late that we've had toward their importance. Like early on, they were obviously super important for a lot of reasons, including lumber. And, today, especially in urban areas, they're mainly seen as aesthetic objects and kind of just something nice to have. And so I wanted to kind of point that out, that we're responding very differently now to tree destruction when when it is the most important time.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously speaking to the choir here. It would be, I sort of think about who is the we that needs to listen, right? And you talk about policymakers and land managers as being two really important sets of actors because they wield an enormous amount of power when it comes to the ways in which we protect our trees and regenerate our forests.
And honestly, this is kind of where I think the book's hopefully power can be, is in order to get people listen, you need to tell them stories. And that's kind of what the book does, is to get people to really look at trees in a deeper, more emotional way.
I was thinking, art is another way of remembering landscapes and trees, painting, music, storytelling, writing. But you mentioned also just your expertise is in monuments and looking at physical objects, like in a preserved landscape. Do you see a difference between the two, or find one stronger? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts about physical memorials versus artwork?
That's a tricky one. I hadn't thought about that. Because memorials often are artwork. One of the things we talk about when in the seminar that I teach, we talk about that good memorials are art. They challenge as much as they recall. So, and art can do that too. So there's an overlap. I was thinking slightly differently as you're asking, though, that because thinking about this idea of retention and memory and keeping something in place. I just yesterday I was at the what's called the site of the Mercer Oak on the Princeton battlefield in New Jersey, the Revolutionary War. It's the site where Hugh Mercer was killed, and it was or where he died, or where he was wounded. I guess he died in a house nearby. And I was interested in that tree because it had stood until about 2000 something, and had become sort of part of the community. It was in the symbol, as I understand it, in Mercer County. It was understood as this sort of central piece of local identity. And so there was a lot of sorrow when the tree finally, died. And in the literature talking about it, they talk about how one person had sort of retained some limbs and had turned them into woodwork. So there's this, art becomes, you can produce art from trees, right? So the tree itself can become art or contribute to it. And then that art, that whatever that, carving or however it's used, then becomes itself a monument, a tribute, a commemoration, and a place of memory. But the other thing they did was they took some acorns and regrew it, which is very much like what Christopher Meyer talks about in his essay, the sort of repropagating the tree. And they have now planted about 10, 15 feet away from. You can see the tiny stump remains of the original. There's a second one now growing, and what is interesting in that overlaps with memorial, and I think speaks to making people think of trees as things that are not just a utility, not just a resource, but something that we need to think more carefully about and more look toward more attention. There's some community sense that space is supposed to be treed. It's just one tree in the middle of the field, but there's this larger sense that there should be a tree there, that the world is in order when there's a tree there. And so when one is gone, they try to replace it with another and replace it with one that is genetically linked to the previous one. So it's such a simple thing. They say, well, it fell, we replanted. It's like, no, it's so much more going on. There's so much more of a sense of what the community is supposed to have, what that landscape is supposed to have, and what the tree represents. So how do you move from putting that kind of reverence, if that's what we want to call it, into one individual tree that has a particular story, connected to a particular event? How does that become? How do we move to something more respectful of trees more generally, and say that, well, if one tree is special, or what's the difference between this one and that one? Is it simply the story attached to it, or they're all playing a role? It's all sort of central to the operations of life. So how do we shift our thinking? And as Leah said before, you tell stories. I think that's a big part of it, but also telling the story with an eye toward developing respect for trees more generally, I think is part of that. It doesn't really answer the question about art, but it's sort of
I'm not sure what my question was exactly. I was just, you got me thinking, and that's what came out.
Memorial. I think the other thing, just it's not again an answer to your question, but it makes me think of it. Art historians, when they teach courses, will often have students go to museums and say you have to spend 45 minutes with a painting. So there's a practice there that overlaps this idea of kind of going and spending time with. So art, memorial, and tree can kind of triangle in some way that, you interact with them. We can move them into a special place. We can see them as things that are worth spending time with.
I talk about the charter oak, which is is Connecticut's tree in my essay, and people in Connecticut are very familiar with the charter oak. But for those not, the charter oak was this colonial tree. It was already probably at least 1,000 years old by the time Europeans settled. It was reportedly used as kind of a council tree for the local native people in the area. And when the King of England revoked the Connecticut charter, or threatened to revoke the colonial charters, some people of Connecticut got together and decided to hide their charter, literally physically hide it, so that he couldn't revoke it. And so they hid it in this old tree, and it's a symbol of Connecticut's independence. And he still revoked the charter, but the whole idea. So the tree becomes this hero in a story, and when it finally died, probably just after the Civil War, or was it, or just before, there was a funeral for it, a community funeral, and to this day, there's pieces of it to get to the art piece all over the state. The legislature has a chair. All kinds of boxes were made from it, all kinds of furniture. Little scions were taken, to replant. And so it's just everywhere, distributed around. And that those pieces of art and objects made from the charter oak are considered very, very precious, and carry that same pride and patriotism or whatever.
Yeah, they're in the Wadsworth Museum, right in Hartford, I think, some of those objects next to the paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we're, as Leah was talking, I was thinking, we're not rural people anymore. Far from a time when 80% of the people, at least European descended people, were farmers of one kind or another. That's not who we are. And as a consequence, sort of an encyclopedic understanding of trees, identifying them simply by leaves or even, by shape, it's not our skill set. It's not taught in schools. We don't prioritize it. So our whole structure of sort of post-industrial capitalism has made knowledge of trees irrelevant. It's not what people need to know. It's not what everyone has. But if you go back into the 18th century, they all understood this stuff. They knew the attributes of trees. They understood how they functioned and and how they worked and what was different one to the other. So the idea of propagating a tree, that's a very natural thing in a rural environment, but it's special in ours. We don't do that, right? And people are doing it, but the average person isn't. In Philadelphia right now, the reason I'm here is a graduate student of mine and I are working on a project for the George Washington Birthplace National Monument on the recipes written by a woman named Sarah Taylor Washington, she had married George Washington's nephew. And she had a handwritten collection of recipes, about 370 some odd recipes. And we've transcribed those, and now we're doing an annotation of them, and we're sort of tracking her down and have come to see the recipes as a sort of biography. It's her autobiography. We're trying to treat her handling of food that way and tell this woman's story. And the piece we didn't know about was where she ended up. And we had found through our research that she was visiting her son's in-laws in Princeton and passed away there in 1834, I think it is. But we didn't know where she was buried, and we just wanted to find that grave. And so that's why we went to Princeton. We were very lucky in that we found it yesterday, but it's not marked, which is why there was nothing in any of the databases. It's an unmarked grave. There's a funeral record that shows that it's her plot, but and that she's there, but there isn't a marker. But what is there is a dogwood tree. And we're sort of fascinated at the fact that a tree has grown right on that spot. And we want to sort of, as we're doing this work, we're sort of interested in figuring out a way to kind of call attention to her. But we wouldn't want to do it in a way that would harm the tree, like let the tree grow, like leave the tree there. So we have to kind of find a way to do a memorialization. We'll talk with people and see what we can do, but to find a way to do a memorialization that incorporates the tree or that uses the tree in some way. And then the next thing would be, can we propagate the tree? Can we take pieces of the tree and bring them back to the places of her life in Virginia and have a tree growing there?
We asked Leah about her piece. We'd like to ask you about your piece in the book, Phil, called George Washington's Cherry Tree, Fairy Farms, Prunus Serotina, and Historical Placemaking. So am I right to assume the topic sort of derived from your book about Fairy Farm, the story of Fairy Farm? I think it was in 2013.
I came to Farm, which was George Washington's childhood home in Fredericksburg in 2002. And never expected to get pulled into this stuff the way that it ended up happening. I think that's often how this works. But the cherry tree in its story became particularly fascinating to me as a memory story. Most of the work we've done there is archaeological. So we've excavated Washington's childhood home. We've excavated quarters for the enslaved nearby. We're in the middle of excavating a kitchen right now. And under the George Washington Foundation, who owns the land, and Director of Archaeology, David Maraca, have been able to sort of put pieces of the landscape back on. So there's a home there now sitting on the archaeology. And David and I have an essay about that, another thing. But trees started to factor into my work because of a building that I think I mentioned in the essay, but didn't have time to go into. But I did write a longer essay about this one tree in a book from 2015 called George Washington Written on the Land. And what happened there is there's a building from the 1870s that by the turn of the century, the early part of after the turn of the century, starts to be called a Washington building. It's transparently a 19th century building. It was not there during Washington's time. And we have extensive photography of the landscape because of the Civil War, and you can see there are no buildings there. So nothing survived above ground from Washington's day. But people wanted there to be a survival, and they sort of attached onto this one building and imbued it with Washington meaning. And an ailanthus tree was growing next to it from a fairly early time once the land started to be seen as historical. And that tree is an imported tree. It's invasive, and it grows extremely quickly. And that, what I wrote about in that other essay, was how the tree's perceived venerability sort of attached onto the building itself. Like the fact of this aged, huge tree that really was only maybe 40 years old, but had sort of overcome and overshadowed this building, kind of created this combined package. At the time, I was very interested in sort of exploring the idea of the tree and what the tree means in that setting. If I were to go back and write that essay again, I'd be much more interested in the interplay of historical meaning. Like how, the next question I would want to ask is, can I trace out how the perceived venerability of the tree, how did that get, if you will, sort of commodified? How did that become a manageable, transferable asset that could be moved from one thing to another? And I'm not sure anybody wrote about that, or I could tease it out, but it's very interested in the way that tree functioned there. And it's also, part of it also is that we had, at the same time, while I was writing about this, we had crews out in a meadow not too far away that was meant to be planted with indigenous grasses. So we're trying to restore it to a sort of pre-contact model. And one of the first tests they had to do was like pluck out ailanthus trees, those little growing, invasive plants. So on the one hand, here's this tree you got to get rid of so you can restore a pre-contact environment as much as possible. But on the other hand, here's this tree that gets imbued with meaning and then attaches to this building. So I had always known about the cherry tree and the role that it plays in Washington mythology. And I did get very interested and have written a lot about the different people who've advocated for the cherry tree, Washington's cherry tree, of chopping it down and telling the truth. How people have who's advocated for that as a true story, because there's a whole contingent that have done that. But what I hadn't done, and what this essay let me do, was say, well, what about the trees? I had known that there were trees over time that had been designated the cherry tree, but there's one particular one, and sort of gleaned it from photographs more than anything. There's people are kind of standing around in a variety of photographs looking at this tree.
Your essay starts with a photograph from 1917 of that cherry tree, or a cherry tree, that's part of national folklore. But the tree wasn't what it seemed to be, right?
No.
What happened at that time?
It's a black cherry, and it doesn't have a particularly long lifespan. It's not a particularly long-lived tree, but it grows quickly, and in Virginia at least, and it stood where people thought such a tree should have stood. And again, the Civil War photographs make clear there's no tree there. But as Ferry Farm is sort of, its owners are sort of promoting it as a historical site, they're trying to create a preservation movement around that property in the early 20th century, and not having success. It's a very difficult project, and they're all amateurs, well-intentioned, but they don't have great contacts, and they're just trying to gin up enthusiasm. And because the site was so long associated with the cherry tree story, serious historians, serious people didn't want anything to do with it. It was seen as frivolous, and that the frivolity of the story, the perceived frivolity of the story, had a negative impact on the preservation of the land. Why preserve something that's associated with a fairy tale? So there were serious preservation movements, and serious money went elsewhere. So this ends up collecting people who are, I won't say unserious, they're serious about what they're serious about, but they're the people who sort of cherry tree enthusiasts. And it became something of a pilgrimage site. You would go and you'd stand by this building that was said to be a Washington building, and next to it was growing this black cherry that was said to be, and everybody's so delicate the way they dance around. This said to be, said to be is enough to kind of give it veneration. But you see people getting photographed at it, and then during the commemoration process, people start putting other cherry trees. So cherry trees become sort of the symbol of this landscape. And year after year, particularly in February, on Washington's birthday, people would come out and plant another cherry. So you get later cherry trees that are smaller ones, but nobody ever contended that those were the cherry tree. They were all sort of echoes, commemorations, living commemorations. But this one tree was said to be the tree, so much so that even when it died, as it collapsed over, they attached wires to it to try to hold the remnants of the trunk up so that it could continue to stand. Then by the early 1940s, there's a commemorative plaque that they put in the ground in front of it. And the plaque is absolutely confident that this is the cherry tree. And it goes all the way through to when it's finally gone, because people are taking souvenirs from it, because it's really still just a farm. People come by, they visit the farmer, and after a while, the farmer and his sons are just selling bits of the cherry tree. They'll take their knife and they'll carve a piece off and sell it to you. And we had a visitor when we started to promote this stuff. After about 2008, we got a lot of press and a lot of attention, and people came and visited. And because it had been a rental farm for a very long time, that land had been a rental farm for a long time, we had people come and tell us their stories about growing up there. And we met people who lived there in the 50s and 70s. And they had stories about when the tree was finally gone, that they just went and got another cherry tree chunk and kept it in a shed. And when visitors would come up, they would just go out and slice a piece off and sell it to them as a souvenir of the site. So people are wanting that. They wanted that physical connection. They wanted to own a piece of the cherry tree. So one tree sort of had the distinction of being the cherry tree, but then others sort of became surrogates and were sort of sold off bit by bit. So here's this then, what it ends up with, this sort of fits into my larger work I'm doing on Washington in memory, that this desire, this desire to connect with Washington is sort of, national project that's been with us for a very long time. The centrality of Washington in the national story, what Washington means to America, the way that he sort of, as people say, I think it's Cunliffe says that, what we say about George, we ultimately are saying about the country itself. So he becomes extremely important and contentious, and you have to handle him delicately. But there's this desire to sort of own something, to have something real. And it's irony on irony on irony, that having a piece of the cherry tree becomes a way to have something real about George. But part of what I did in this essay that I think makes it what I want to push was that it was the unique attributes of this tree itself that facilitated that. These smaller cherry trees, or these Japanese cherry trees that get brought in later, could never be mistaken for the original because they just don't have the right attributes. The black cherry grows a particularly dark and deeply rutted bark and does it very quickly. So like the ailanthus tree that I saw at this other building, the black cherry looks older than it is. It's sort of it can trick people, particularly people, as I mentioned before, who are not particularly tree savvy. It can trick them into thinking it's a thing it isn't. And were it another kind of tree, that would not have happened. So to me, it's like that's where this whole idea of agency comes into this. It's the tree itself that's sort of calling these stories and collecting the stories to itself. A different tree would not have been able to do that.
And yet it probably meant a lot to a lot of people who visited the site and touched the tree.
There's a story of a piece of it, or maybe even the last remnants. I didn't write about this, but I knew this story from our oral history interviews, that ended up in a bar or some kind of restaurant not too far away as a souvenir. And there was a fire at that restaurant sometime in the 80s, I think. And the owner went in and took the tree out, went and grabbed the little remnant and brought it out, saved it from the fire. It was special enough that it was worth saving from the fire. So yeah, very special, right? This matters to people immensely. And cracking apart that content, what is it that's mattering? Is it some kind of, is it obviously it's patriotism, one kind or another? Is it memory? Is it historical sense? Is it Americanism? What are they connecting with? But the tree becomes such a powerful symbol. And in Washington's story, I've written about this elsewhere, but there's still more to say. In Washington's story, the way that the tree works for and against him, the way that people use it to attach to him, but then another group of people will specifically deride the cherry tree story as a way to attach also. Like, I'm really attaching by avoiding the silly stories. So whether you embrace the tree and attach that way or reject the tree and attach that way, the tree still remains there. So to have one that was sort of physically there kind of pushes that even further.
Yeah, the claims people make about trees, right? That's sort of a thread throughout the book. It reminds me of Elena Perrot's Oaks of Repute. Yeah, this sort of idea that, there are facts about a tree, and then there are claims that people can make about a tree sort of in parallel with a different set of facts. And it's not the sort of quote unquote truth is not as important as some of the meanings that people are imbuing or ascribing to a tree, because the tree is a stand-in or representation for other more powerful experiences than facts.
There's right? There is a truth, the truth of the brutality, right? It's absolutely true. It doesn't, you could say it sort of doesn't matter whether it's this tree or not this tree. The truth is still there, and the tree can serve as a surrogate. It can be a representative, and people have a desire to sort of have the physical remnant because they want to be able to point to it. They want to be able to make a claim about the consequences of the brutality when the brutality is not sort of visibly happening in that moment in that place. And so you get a carryover that's sort of, that's there. And it ultimately, I think it parallels very well with the cherry tree. It doesn't matter after a while whether this is the real one or not. It's speaking to some higher truth. And the tree can be a surrogate. It's still a tree.
I think it's because the tree does have this, it's living, right? It's living, and even after it dies, it can continue to live. Trees are resilient. If you replant, if you take care of them. And so there is an interesting difference between a building and a tree in terms of how it's going to hold that memory. Trees kind of have their own category here. In terms of both a natural and a cultural, it shares things with both of them.
Once an historical building story is debunked, it's sort of the energy goes away from it. It stops being that. Trees just function differently. Like Leah says, I think it's because she's right. It's because they're living. There's just an attribute that's different about them, and that pushes things into a different place. And a lot of our categories are going to come from preservation of non-animate objects, because that's where the work's been done. But more and more, I think what we were seeing as we did this work, and we're hoping to push people to see and continue to work on, is that the living and the living object also it's different. It needs its own typology. It needs its own vocabulary. It's difficult to, it's not enough just call it a vivifact, right? Which is fine, but that only begins to open the door to a whole other way to talk about how memory is functioning within and around these kinds of objects.
Yeah, and it has a different effect on people too, because this tree was alive when whatever historical event was, and that's just feels remarkable, I think, to people.
Yeah, the witness part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and many of the chapters, the essays in this book are witness trees, whether actually or representationally. One of the features of this volume is the ways that some of the authors tackle really painful histories. People talk about slavery and lynching and redlining and residential schools. And I'm curious to hear from you both about the importance of telling these kinds of stories and using trees to do that. I mean, I think there's also just a bigger question of sometimes these are not the stories that are included in a canon of urban forestry. If you think of books that have been written about elms or etc., right? You're not necessarily getting these stories that people might want to forget, or that some people might want to forget.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of things like redlining, it's really the lack of trees that is an interesting issue. And it's kind of fascinating because those who know the history of redlining and the attempts to segregate these different neighborhoods and where people live, but with that came changes in the landscape of these neighborhoods, so that today, historically, redline neighborhoods tend to lack trees. And what that means, and the lack of those trees, is what contributes to an injustice environmentally and socially. On a day like today, there's absolutely no relief, right? There's no shade, and they've tested temperatures at different universities, between how hot it is in neighborhoods without trees versus those with. And so there's the public health, there's air quality issues, and so we wanted to at least make sure that, as rich and interesting as some of these tree stories are, again, as part of that awareness of the importance of trees, we need to understand what the lack of them means and who gets access to them and who doesn't, who can be a part of that and who can't. And that trees don't have the same association with everybody, depending on who you are. Everybody's going to approach it with a very different perspective. As an example, with a lynching tree, people are not going to look at a tree like that if they know the history in the same way.
It also might be in part that, unlike, say, a building, a preserved or commemorated building, which will have an apparatus around, a sort of social apparatus around it about how it gets preserved and who gets to determine what gets said there and about it, with a kind of hierarchy. The trees, a tree doesn't have that as easily. Anybody can, like Leah said, anybody can attach to it as they choose to. So in a way, they're better spaces to sort of get at, what we might call subaltern histories, right? To get at people, stories that aren't told as readily, because they're just there to be interpreted by anybody who wants to interpret them, whereas other things may have more of an official apparatus around them.
Yeah, there's an example of a tree like this in my neighborhood. It has an unfortunate name, which, from my perspective, sort of prevents or obscures other sites of lynchings in the neighborhood that are documented. And so the tree then, and the way what people believe about the history of this particular tree, is really a sort of trigger for really deep conversations, not only about the tree, but about the bigger neighborhood and the history of New York City more generally. So I think that sort of lack of official armature really allows kinds of conversations that wouldn't necessarily take place if there is an official story.
Right, very much so. And it also does something else, and this goes back to the idea that it's a whole alternate way of understanding preservation and memory through trees. That because the object in focus is a tree, is a living thing, and is part of our larger environmental world, it enables the next discussion more easily. So you can take, I keep on thinking about, I've written about this as well, the sort of, for Ferry Farm, the sort of come to learn about George's childhood and walk away with an understanding of what local production means, like why how local production is environmentally healthy. The cherry tree story itself is an environmental parable, and I think was intended by Parson Weems when he wrote it to be an environmental parable. So by talking about the tree, it opens up different doors than if we just talk about redlining as an urban phenomenon, say, for example, or a lynching. That once we're talking about the tree, we then get to sort of segue into a larger discussion of the peril that life is facing now because of climate change. So it pushes us in that direction. It's a springboard in a way that other kinds of discussions aren't. And I think that's part of what I know that Leah and I've talked about, the kind of wanting to see that it's like it goes into that space. It opens the door to talking about life's peril more broadly in a way that other kinds of things just don't. And, difficult to make a museum move in that direction. But the tree invites us have that discussion.
I think we could probably talk for hours about this topic and probably each one of the essays in here because they're so rich in material and thoughtfulness. But I have a question in light of everything we've spoken about. Who do you hope to appeal to most with this book? Who would you say the book is for?
I mean, I think we kind of addressed this. I would love to, obviously, love for the general public to be exposed, but particularly people who are making decisions about planning and policy, and understanding, and that's in terms of the cities, but really also impacting people who are concerned about climate change and think of it only as natural and scientific solutions to that. And this is an approach where we're saying that in order to make people care about these natural objects and landscapes, you also need the humanities, and you need nuance and complexity in terms of their cultural meaning. And so certainly, I think we're looking for some kind of grassroots, but ultimately just to start people talking about different ways to battle, like different approaches, different perspective, different ways to come to battle on this kind of crisis we're in terms of climate change. And I talk about, trees as a superhero in all of this because they are cleaning the air, right? They are absorbing the carbon. They are a huge player in all of this. And we need to come from all sides.
I think also I would add a somewhat parochial element to that, essay volumes are, I don't know how much the general public reads essay volumes, but students do. And it's, I'm hoping, very assignable. And so I would love to see this become a part of public history curricula for a while, see it be part of the syllabus so that it can put some of these ideas in the heads of the students who then go on to become museum professionals, preservation professionals, and even.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we definitely need all the tools, right? It's not only a technological fix, but, relationships are a really important part of addressing climate change, and the humanities really excel at thinking about relationships.
Getting people to care about things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Climate change is a humanities problem. If the scientific evidence was persuasive, it would have persuaded already.
That was our pitch. Yeah.
If solutions were solutions, they would have solved. It's a humanities problem. It's about how people think. It's about how people relate and the relationships and communities they exist in. So it's an all hands to the deck moment, I think.
Yeah, and that's actually, I don't know, I find that really hopeful, right? There are as many sort of relational solutions as there are people potentially, and definitely encouraging people to share their stories about their relationships with trees and how trees are a part of their everyday lives seems really important. I mean, just to echo Doug, I think we could talk for many more hours because there are many more chapters that we haven't touched on. But I really want to thank you both for being the inaugural authors on this podcast. This conversation has been really rich, and there's a lot that I'm thinking about right now because of this work.
And we appreciate the opportunity to take a deep dive into these tree stories with you.
And we definitely want to thank you for being, I think, our inaugural podcast, right, in terms of this book. And we love that it's such a great fit for what you guys are doing.
Yeah, and thank you for having us, and it was lovely to meet you and talk with you. And thank you for what you're doing as well. I mean, I'm hoping this project isn't over. I mean, just since the book came out, I think I've seen 7 different trees that they're essays. So I'm starting to think that there needs to be either a son of branching out, or branching out 2.0, or a journal, maybe a possibility to continue this, to specifically do this kind of work. But there's so many stories out there, and they're not being harvested, and it'd be so wonderful to put that together. And I think this podcast, your work with this helps immensely helps to forward that project.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Great to meet you both.
And listeners, if you like what you heard, you can purchase Branching Out, The Public History of Trees, edited by Leah, Glaser, and Philip Levy, using the affiliate link on this page. 10% goes to support our efforts, and 10% goes to support local bookstores. Thanks for joining us on Tree Book Passages. See you next time.
And keep reading.